You're old news.
It'll just be you and me, right?
You and me.
Yeah. Yeah. You and me, and we'll each tell each other we're wrong.
I could be the reason why they aren't.
I think they're celebrating the shutdown of the federal government. That's what. You know, what would be the worst thing is the federal government shuts down and nobody notices. That would be the worst thing.
Well, the worst thing is they have this category called non-essential workers.
Yeah, imagine that.
Well, what did they hire them in the first place?
Well, imagine, giving your life and discovering that you were a non-essential worker, right? Yeah, we didn't mind having you around, but we didn't need you.
We want our non-essential workers back. I mean, it's ridiculous.
That's great. We should have a shul shutdown. That would be even. All right, good morning, welcome. It's good to see everybody. I want to say a very special blessing. Welcome my dad back. He survived a lot, and it's wonderful. You didn't miss that thing, though. We haven't gone any farther in the Torah since you left. But it's great to have you back, Pop. Thanks for coming back. And where's Tony? Tony, thank you for schlepping him. Thanks for bringing him this morning. Welcome to our Torah study. Good morning. It's nice to see everybody. It's a little chilly outside, so we'll stay warm in here. Anyone here last night? Anyone here last night? Whoa, if you didn't get here last night, you missed an experience. Oh, my God. We had the great gospel choir, Dr. D and the Sacred Chorale Singers, Sacred Praise Chorale Choir. They were fabulous. And the Beit Tshuva Band, which is fabulous. And Rabbi Mark is on fire. It was a little strange if you're used to services, but it was, because you couldn't quite figure out, like, what the hell is going on. But it was wonderful. It was a joy, yeah. Yeah. Well, I had my moment, my Martin Luther King moment, right? Preaching in front of an African American, a black choir, is so much better than preaching in front of Jews, right? Because you preach in front of Jews, he'll tell you, you preach in front of Jews, and they sit there like dead people, And no matter what you say, it's right? You preach in front of an African, and they give you feedback, right?
Hallelujah.
Amen.
Hallelujah. Praise Jesus.
It's not, well,
Sorry.
Calm down.
I'm sorry.
Calm down, Gelman. Calm down.
My best friend was a priest.
I know.
It wears off.
Yeah. Well, but he never did that. They don't do that. So, anyway, it was wonderful. So, following our service this morning, there's a lovely young guy having his bar mitzvah, a really sweet little boy. And then following that, there's Torah study with Judy. Where's Judy? Yeah, in the youth lounge, and everybody's invited to that. Welcome, guys. This week, on Wednesday night, we continue with our study of Jewish history through the College of Jewish Studies. And our guest speaker this week, last week was wonderful. Dina Aronoff brought the Maimonides to life. This week, Dr. Sarah Stein, who's a professor of history at UCLA and is an expert on the Sephardic culture, Sephardic Jewry. And she'll bring us a whole wonderful sense of the Sephardic community and its culture. So it's a wonderful, if you grew up like me as a gringo, and you never quite knew who those people were, this is if you grew up Sephardic and you didn't know the history of your community, it's a remarkable history. And we now have tremendous documentation of the texture of everyday life in Sephardic communities of the Middle Ages. And that'll be Professor Stein's topic. And then on Wednesday nights, if you continue, we're going to continue through February. The next unit that we're going to take up is Jewish modernity. We'll talk about what modernity means. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, too, today. And then we have 3 lectures, guest lectures. Gil Graff, who's the head of the BJE, a professor, he's also a doctor of Jewish history, is going to talk about the religious life of pre-war European Jews. What happened in that pre-war moment. And then we have 2 very special sessions. Steve Ross, who's a professor of history at USC, has just come out with a marvelous book. I heard him interviewed, and I went and bought the book, about the Nazis of Hollywood. And if you haven't heard him interviewed, basically the story was that the Third Reich targeted Hollywood and sent all these agents into Hollywood in the 30s to try to influence the American media world. And they were stopped by a conspiracy of Jews, lawyers, and Christian non-Jewish Americans who didn't want America to become that. And that story and it happened right here in LA, and it's a remarkable story, and it's about Jewish power in America and the development of a sense of Jewish power in America. So he'll be our guest. And then Professor Daniel Kotkin of UCLA will be coming to talk about how Israel has changed our lives. So that's going to be the month of February, and everybody's invited. So it's Wednesday night, 7 o'clock. It's free, and we serve good cookies now. Yes, please.
Rabbi, I didn't hear, when's the Sephardic night?
That's this coming Wednesday night. Yeah, this coming Wednesday night. And then two other quick things just so you can put on your calendar. At the end of February, I think it's the 26th of February, it's the Monday night, last week in February, we're joining with the Jewish Republican Coalition to bring Larry Elder, who's a guy on the radio, wonderful speaker on the radio. Yeah, he's going to be speaking here, and you're all invited. There's a nominal charge because he wants a lot of money. Well, not really relative to other speakers, but and to cover the costs. But if anybody can't afford it, let me know because it's on the 26th of February, right here in the synagogue. Okay, and then in March, for anybody who'd like, we're going to Israel. I'm taking a trip to Israel. We do this every 3-4 years. This is not a good trip for first-timers. You've never been to Israel? We'll take you to Israel. Rabbi Hoffman goes every summer with a group of people who've never been before. And they get to see all the major sites, the major historical places. This is a trip for people who've been there and want to know more about the inner life of Israelis, the inner life of Israel, the issues that shape Israel. So what we do is we take an issue a day. So we're going to take, for example, one day we'll do Palestinians. We're going to talk about Israel and Palestine. And we're going to go into Ramallah. And we're going to meet with members of the Palestinian Authority government. And then we're going to talk to the Israeli government people about their conversations. We're going to spend a day with the ultra-Orthodox. You have to dress special. And we'll spend a day with the ultra-Orthodox community and find out how the ultra-Orthodox community is actually moving and changing, much to their own chagrin. We'll spend a day talking about Israeli identity. We'll spend a day on the northern border, looking over the border into Lebanon and Syria. There's a place in the Golan where you can see Lebanon and Syria, and you can see where ISIS is, where Hezbollah is, where Al-Qaeda is. It's amazing. There's one spot where you can stand, and our guide will be the commander, the northern commander of Israeli Defense Forces. So we take an issue a day, and then in the evenings we enjoy the great food culture of Israel. Israel's now a great foodie place. So we go to a great restaurant, we eat big meals, we drink a lot of wine, we dance on the tables, and then we get up in the morning and do it all over again. So if anyone would like to come, Alana Zimmerman, there's a flyer in the hallway, and Alana Zimmerman is organizing the trip, and she'd be glad to speak to you about this, okay?
How long is the trip?
We start on the 7th, we end on the 15th. It's a 7-day trip, but you can extend either way. The reason we made it so short is because everybody extends to go see their relatives. Or to go to Petra, or to stop in London. So we decided, number one, we'll help you, but you'll make your own flight arrangements. It's cheaper if you do it. And number two, extend the trip, and we can help arrange that for you. We can get you hotels and tour guides and cars and all kinds of stuff. But we'd like you to have a chance to do it on your own. But our trip is 7 days. It starts on Wednesday, and it ends on Wednesday night. Yes, Marcia. Well, take a look. It's the night. If you take a look, you'll see what it is. It's a 1 a.m. flight on Thursday morning. So we go to dinner Wednesday night. We eat a huge meal, drink copious amounts of wine. We take you to the airport, and you wake up somewhere across the Atlantic. That's what happens. Wait a minute. How did I get here? That's how it happened. Okay. Good. So I hope everybody can. If anyone be interested, we'd love to have you come with us. Okay. This morning we're in Parshas Bo, which is the third Parsha, the third section of the story of the Exodus. It's in your Chumash. You got a Chumash? And this is a very interesting, the structure of this Parsha is very interesting because it raises some very interesting issues. So let me introduce it this way. The first time I did a funeral, I was newly graduated from the seminary. I moved to Dallas, Texas. I was responsible for building the day school. And that was my principal responsibility in the synagogue. But I also had responsibilities as a pulpit rabbi in the synagogue. And there was a senior rabbi, lovely guy. And the senior rabbi had an interesting custom. Right after the high holidays, he'd go away for 2 weeks and leave me the shul. So in the course of his going away 2 weeks, the first year I was there, the patriarch of one of the major families of the community died. 90-something-year-old gentleman with children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and a huge family. Very important guy, very important family of the community. And the secretary comes into my office and says, they need you to do the funeral. Gulp. I'd never done a funeral before. I'd barely even been to a funeral before. But I remember I got my notes out from school about what you do, you know. So I said, please gather the family. I'd like to meet with everybody and talk about the funeral. So they set a time, and I put on my nicest little suit. I was littler then, and got in the car and drove there. And as I'm driving, I'm saying to myself, what the hell are you doing? You don't know anything about this. You've never done this before. You're going to screw this. And I'm talking myself out of it. You ever done that before? You know, I'm trying to remember where I put the law school applications, you know? And finally, I get to the house, and I parked about a half a block away. And I'm just sitting in the car by myself going, why am I'm 25, 26, 27 years old, and newly married, and help! And I'm sitting in the car, and I hear a knock on the window, and it's one of the kids of the family. Rabbi, y'all okay? You all come in? Okay, busted, you know. So I said, yeah, fine. So I get out of the car, and I walk in the house. It's a huge house. Dallas, they have big houses. And the whole family's sitting around living. I'm not exaggerating, 75 people. Because the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, cousins, they're all there, and they're all sitting, and they save a place for me in the middle. So he's like, gulp, you know? And you sit down in the middle, and I'm looking around, and they're all like silent. And the widow, who's also in her 90s, is sitting across from me, and she's weeping, and her daughters are with her, and it's okay, Mama, the rabbi's here. He's going to tell us something wise. And I'm saying, like, please, God. Now, there's a line in the book of Psalms that says, Shomer Pitaim Adonai. God takes care of idiots, right? And it's the truth, baby. It is the truth. Because out of my mouth came something which I did not expect. It wasn't mine. It was revelation. Because suddenly I looked up at all these people and I said, tell me about your dad. And there's this silence because they expected me to tell them all about the rites and rituals and wisdom of life and death. And all I said was, tell me about your pop. And they said, well, what do you want to know? And I said, everything. How did he get to Texas? Ah, that's a story. And they start telling this whole story about how he was born in Poland, and they came across, and they got to Ellis Island, and there was a family member in Houston, and he got on the train with the family, and they were supposed to go to Houston. I mean, this whole story, and they got off in Dallas by mistake, and the community was there to greet them, so they settled. That was, say, 100 years ago, and they start just telling this whole story, and I'm just writing all this down. And then one story leads to another story. And then one cousin says, no, it wasn't like that. It was like this. I said, really? Are you sure? Yeah, because that's what my dad told me. And then the kids are going, really? And then at one point, I looked up, and the widow is still sitting here. She's a 90-year-old lady, and she's sort of weeping. And I said, Mrs. So-and-so, how did you meet him? And out of her tears, this little smile creeps across her head. Well, his brother had a Packard. And so one of the kids says, Mama, what's a Packard? And she shakes her head and says, oh, it's a very nice car. And he borrowed his brother's car and picked me up from high school. He picked you up from, yes, and he drove me home. And on the way home, he asked me if we could go out, right? And so I said, yes. Yeah, then what happened, right? Well, Saturday night came, and I put on my nice clothes, and he took us out for a drive. And at that time, the city wasn't so built, so there was like things to see. And then the kid said, and then what happened? And she looked up, pointed to her oldest son, and said, and 9 months later, you were born. And all the grandkids said, Mama? And she said, it was a Packard. It had a big back seat, you know. And then somebody went and they got pictures of Mama, you know. They got the wedding picture and they got pictures of her, and they passed it around. And the great-grandchildren, who were like young teenagers, look at this and they say, Mama, you were hot. Like, they never imagined, because they knew her whole life as an old lady, you know. They never imagined that once she was this ingenue, she was this gorgeous young woman. And the wedding picture, you know how they used to take wedding pictures? Everybody ended up looking like Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert, you know, just beautiful pictures. I don't know if they touched them up, but they were just beautiful. And suddenly, all the stories started coming. Stories. We are our stories. That's what we leave behind when we leave this world. But even in this world, we are our stories. If I ask you to turn to the person next to you and introduce yourself, you would tell a story. How'd you get here? Who are you? How did your family get here? What do you do for a living? How did you get into that line of work? We all tell stories. Stories, if you put it this way, it's not so much that we tell stories, stories tell us, because we then live our stories. Because if I understand that as my story, then that comes with a set of obligations and a set of claims on me. That's who I am. The telling of a story is a point of identity. It places me on a grid of space and time. It places me on a social grid of where I fit. The telling of a story, right? So the interesting thing is that once upon a time, you were born into stories. Right, your parents told who you were as the stories were told at your dinner table. One of the interesting facts of modernity, we'll talk about this in a couple of weeks in the college class, is that we now choose our stories. What is my story? What story do I tell about myself? And what story do I want to tell about myself? Just as an aside, if you've ever had any experience with therapy, I mean, what therapy is, you go in and you pay this person an enormous amount of money to tell them your story, and the person says, I know why you're unhappy. You're telling the story wrong. And what the therapist tries to do, I'm going to save you a lot of money now. What the therapist tries to do is to help you tell the story differently, or tell a different story about yourself. If you tell a different story, things change, right? Rabbis will tell you this. A couple having problems comes to see the rabbi. And what always happens inevitably is that each of them comes and tells you a complete story, which is completely coherent and completely believable and completely opposite each other, right? He tells you about how she does this and she does that, and it's so unreasonable, and all he did is ask, and she tells you this story about he does this and he does this, and it's so unreasonable, and you listen, and you realize that you can't verify either story, at least from what you hear, because you have no other evidence except the coherence of the story and the conviction behind the story. And they're both right. In other words, they're both telling you the story as they experience it. And the only way to get them to talk to each other is to get them to sort of loosen their grip on the story and listen to the other person's story, which is really hard to do, listen to the other person's story. And that's precisely today what we're going to take a look at, because we're going to have two men who are going to meet face to face in today's Torah portion for the last time. And each of them has a story to tell about who he is and what his mission is in the world, Pharaoh and Moses. Right? And I would suggest, without getting into the particular of the politics, that what you heard, if you've been watching the news, what's going on in Washington, is also a story, is also a conflict of stories. Because Democrats and Republicans have very different stories about what the function of government is, about what's the responsibilities of the collective and the individual. And the confrontation of those two stories yields these kinds of confrontations, these kind of stalemates, until you can start to hear the other story and start to compromise and let go of the death grip you have on your story, so that you can admit the other person's story into your story. That's how you negotiate. That's what deal making really is. That's what negotiations really is. But it's really hard to let go of your story, because your story defines you. It defines you. And to let go of that definition is very difficult. It's a threat to self. So here we are in the Parsha's boat. There are 4 Torah portions that tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt, right? Shemot, Va'era, Boa, and Bishalach, right? Next week, Bishalach is the story of the crossing of the Red Sea, okay? All right, that's next week's story. By the way, next week I'm not going to be here, but next week we have a very special guest coming back to teach us, a guest teacher, Rabbi Jonathan Slater, who's the spiritual director of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, is going to be here with Cantor Barron, and he's going to lead our teaching next week, and I'll be back the following week. I'm going up to see Simi, okay? But here, next week's story is the crossing of the Red Sea. This week is the last of the 3 plagues, the last of the 10 plagues. It's locust, darkness, and the death of the firstborn. Moses' last confrontation with Pharaoh. And then in the middle of the Parsha, the whole thing changes. And it hints that at the very beginning. So if you have a Chumash, take a look with me. Everybody good so far? Page 374. The Lord said to Moses. Now it starts with a mistranslation. It says, Bo el Paro. Bo, as every Hebrew school kid tells you, means come. But here it's translated as go, which is very interesting. We can spend some time with that, but we won't. Go to Pharaoh, come to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his courtiers, his court, in order that I may display my signs among them. And now listen to the next line. What's the purpose of this whole drama? We thought that the purpose of this whole drama was to liberate the Israelites from slavery and allow them to return home to their land. That's not it. In this Torah portion, we have a very different idea of what the whole thing is about. And what you're going to notice here is a funny trick of literature. And it's a very modern trick of literature, but the Bible understands it, which is that the time sense of who the text is talking to and where the text fits in time is going to jump around a little bit. Because in the middle of the narrative, in the middle of the story of the plagues, God says, I'm going to harden his heart, that I may display signs among them, that you may recount in the hearing of your children and your children's children how I made a mockery of the Egyptians and how I displayed my signs among them, in order that you may know that I am the Lord. Why am I doing all this? I could have let you out with one plague. I didn't need plagues at all, right? And I've been messing with Pharaoh, hardening his heart. It's the stuff that Rabbi Gelman is upset about, and he's right.
Extremely upset.
I know. I just make sure that, but he's right. Philosophically, he's right. But dramatically, right? What's the purpose of this whole drama? The whole drama is to reset the Israelite story. In fact, this is going to become the story. This is the core narrative of the Israelite people, the Jewish people. You ask a Jewish person, who are you? He or she will tell you, not I came from Newark, or my parents were. The first line of any one Jewish person's autobiography is, I was a slave in the land of Egypt. You won't understand me unless you know that. You won't understand my mishigas. And let me tell you something, I got mishigas. I got a lot of mishigas. And why do I have all this mishigas? Why do I have all this lunacy in me? Because I carry around the wounds of having been a slave. And not just that, it's twofold. A, I have the wounds of having been a slave. But see, if you stop there, you end up with a terrible victim mentality. And people who are victims often become victimizers. Because if I've been hurt, then I have a right to hurt the other. And so the second one is, not only do I carry the wounds of having been a slave, I carry the memory, the vision in front of me of having been liberated. The experience of having been liberated changed my whole notion of how the world works. My whole notion of where I fit in the world, who I am. My whole notion of what I can expect out of the world and out of life. Those two memories, the memory of slavery and the memory of redemption, are the core principles, the core pillars of Jewish identity. So, by the way, so what you're going to do is you're going to rehearse them over and over again, right? Now, you all know about Pesach. You do know about Pesach, right? So Pesach, you're going to spend 8 days telling this story, right? You're going to do it twice at the Seder, and then if you're like us, you're going to clean the refrigerator and clean all the stuff out of it a whole week, swear off pizza, pasta, pickles, and pretzels. Foods that start with P, because Pharaoh starts with a P, right? So you're going to spend 8 days, but not just then, as they say on television. But wait, right? Every day, putting on tefillin. You'll see in a moment at the end of the Parsha is an experience of slavery, is a remembrance of slavery. You're going to recite the Song of the Sea twice a day in your prayers. This is the memory that the tradition needs to hammer home again and again and again and again. Why? Because the slavery narrative determines your social ethics, and the redemption narrative mediates your sense of how the world works, your vision of history and how history works. This is the story at the core of our identity. This is who we are. This is how we define ourselves. And that's going to be told in this particular Torah portion, right? So now you're going to see this in this Torah portion, more than the other ones that we've read in Exodus. The narrative goes back and forth between this is what you're going to do to Pharaoh and this is what you're going to tell your children. Now this Torah portion there's an acute awareness of how the story will be told in later generations, how the story will be remembered, how the story was going to be, what lessons you're going to draw from this particular story. You're in agony over here.
I just finished Richard Elliott Friedman's The Exodus.
Good. How is it? Any good?
Well, it's a lot different than what we're about to read.
Yes.
In the sense that he's not decrying that an Exodus didn't occur.
Yeah.
But what he would say is that the story that you're telling is more important than the actual events, because what he reconstructs as the events is a hell of a lot different than what we're reading here.
Yeah. Right. And the story that family told me in that living room of Dallas, do you think all those things actually happened the way they told me?
Probably not.
No. Because over the course of telling and retelling and fashioning memory is different than history, right? History is, what you can construct from the evidence, right? Memory is something that you construct for other purposes and other reasons. And so if I ask you your family's story, you would tell me things that I don't think that they would be empirically untrue, completely untrue, but they would certainly be told in a way that might not be what we'd call empirically, evident, right? Because memory is told for different purposes than history. Okay? You want to come in? We got room. We got room. Everybody's move over and make a little room for folks. Come on. Does that make some sense?
Well,
Yeah.
Michael Oren once
Yeah.
said that great wars in history
Yeah.
become great wars about history.
Yes, right. Right. So here's it's a very important point. So let's get Douglas's point. Richard Elliott Friedman is a Bible critic, a scholar of Bible. He was at UCSD for many years.
Georgia.
And now he moved to Georgia. And he wrote a very good book called Who Wrote the Bible, by the way, which is a wonderful book. It's about the Torah, not the whole Bible, and it's a detective novel. It's a detective story. It's a wonderful story. So he just wrote a book about the Exodus, right? And what he's trying to deal with is some of the issues around, did the Exodus really happen? Okay? Because the problem is we don't have archaeological evidence for this, and for some strange reason, somebody erased the videotape. There was a video camera at the exit of Egypt, and it showed the security camera, and it showed 602,000 Israelites leaving, and some poor schnook erased the tape. I don't know how that happened, but it happened, right? So now we have there are a few. The only evidence we have is there is what's called a stele. A stele is like a pillar that a story was written on. It's in Egypt. It's in Lower Egypt, and the Pharaoh says, "I wiped out Israel." Right? I wiped out Israel. That's the only evidence we have that Israel and Egypt had relations with each other at this time, archaeologically at this time. But the stele says that he wiped them out. So we don't have any archaeological evidence to demonstrate that this empirically happened. So now you're playing a game of, could it have happened? And what would be reasonable to imagine that it happened? Okay, and that's a very interesting game to play, right? Because then you got to say, well, what of the story might have been historical, factual, given what we know about the politics and the society of Egypt at that moment? And we know a lot, because we have archaeology of the period. Okay? And what is obviously literary embellishment, miracle stories and other kinds of things that we have a hard time accepting, right? And in the end, that's a fun exercise to play. So people will say, well, there was a volcano in Sudan, and that's why the Nile filled with red clay, which make it look like blood, and the frogs multiplied because the clay increased the carbon dioxide. Yeah, you can play that game. It's not as interesting to me. I think what you said is much more interesting. What story did we tell about this? The empirical facts of the thing are not nearly as important to me as the story we decided to tell. And what is the implication of the story we decided to tell? And what happens if there's more than one story that we decided to tell? Believe it or not, people can experience an historical event and generations later tell different stories about it. Right? We have a story about an event that took place on July 4th, 1776. You might have heard of this story, right? right? The Declaration of Independence, a group of great American patriots gathered in Philadelphia to sign the Declaration and declare our independence from the tyranny of Britain. The British have a different story. The British said, the British story is they had this lunatic king who wouldn't listen to good advice. I mean, the British have a very different story, right? I mean, and we told different stories about that. The Civil War was fought over differing stories. That's Michael Oren's point. So when you have a conflict of stories, sometimes you come to blows in order to establish the story as the story. It's a very good point. Yes, please. Someone had a hand up. Yeah.
I was just going to say the same thing, that the English have a totally different.
Yeah, they see it very differently. George was a little loony, and members of Parliament wanted to make an accommodation with the colonists. Canada became liberated right after us, and it was cheaper. I mean, they did it much easier, and there's a much different society than we do. You want to come sit down? There's plenty of room. Okay, so take a look with me. Everybody good so far? Everybody happy? All right, any other questions, comments, counter sermons, as long as we're here? More, yeah.
So why is this our story? Why is it founded on a deception of walking for 3 days?
Oh, that's a great question. Michael Halpern always asks me that question. When Moses goes to Pharaoh, what does he ask him for?
3 days.
He doesn't say we're leaving forever. He asks him to go into the desert for 3
It
days.
doesn't say we're going to take all your gold and silver. either.
That's also true, right. Now, so the question is, but here's the question, Mort. First of all, was that a deception, or was that Moses' plan?
That was God's instruction to Moses.
Yes, but I'm asking you, was that a deception, or was that was the plan always to make a break for it, and that was simply what they told Pharaoh? Or was the plan really to go into the desert, and it's only at the...
He was deceived.
Yeah, but only at the end. Is that what the plan was? Or only at the end of the story did they change their mind and decide they really were going to make a break for it?
But an all-powerful God, why is he deceiving Pharaoh?
Because the point is he's trying to... I think what he's trying to do is help Pharaoh save face a little bit, right? Right?
Very considerate of him.
I think so.
Yeah, that's why he hardened his heart.
Right.
Extremely compassionate.
I know. I know you have a hard time. I know you
Boy,
have.
he's right.
I know.
He just nailed you.
I know. I'm not. Being nailed by Mort is an honor.
I understand.
Mort is an honorable and moral man and deeply wise, and he's right. So the whole thing is based on sort of a deception, except there's a common understanding between them. They understand the deception. I think it's diplomatic language. I think he understands fully. Look, because Pharaoh says to him, you'll hear in the narrative, right? Pharaoh says to him, tell you what, take the men, leave the women and the children. And Moses rejects that. So then Pharaoh says, okay, take the women and the children, but leave all the animals. And Moses rejects that, right? This is a diplomatic language. This is a diplomatic language, right? You ask for something, but the understanding between the two of them is very clear. And look, deep down, for Pharaoh to let this slave community go into the desert and worship their God is to acknowledge that God has beaten him. And that's really what the narrative is about. Pharaoh has to change his story. Pharaoh's story is, I'm the master of Egypt. I'm the master of the world. I'm the son of Ra. His name is Ramesses, the son of Ra. I am the son of the God king. I'm the son of the Sun King, right? I am the son of the Sun King. I am the most powerful person on the planet. I am the God who rules the world. And for him to acknowledge that there's something bigger than him, and that it belongs to the slaves, that it's the slaves who have bested him, is a complete overturning of his honor. That's the hardening of the heart. He can't buy that. It's too dissonant. It's too different. It opposes everything he believes in. That a God of slaves destroyed Egypt and turned him and broke him? Too hard for him to imagine. He would rather, and you'll see this at the very beginning, he would rather lose Egypt than lose his story. Right? Look at what happens. Look, come in this text with me, right? So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and they said, thus says the Lord God of the Hebrews, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go. If you refuse, tomorrow I bring locusts. I said yesterday, the first 6 plagues were nasty, but they weren't annihilation, right? Blood, all right, so there's nothing to drink. Frogs, ugh, bugs, lice, diseases. These are horrible. When you get to barad, when you get to hail, you get a sense of something which is like another layer of destruction. This is going to destroy stuff. Locust. I don't imagine any of you have ever been through a locust infestation. First of all, you know what a locust looks like? Like you have like a grasshopper, and then you got like a locust, right? These things are like, this is a gesunde grasshopper, all right? And they come in a mishpacha epis. I mean, and they eat everything. They eat everything. This is all of the greenery in the whole country. This is annihilation. This is Hiroshima. This is Hiroshima. That's what Moses is bringing next. These three plagues, locust, then darkness, and then the death of the firstborn, are different than the other ones because this is annihilation. And this is what makes Rabbi Gelman so upset, because at this point, Pharaoh really can't say no. Pharaoh can't say no. And the only purpose of this drama now is to so annihilate Egypt that you leave an impression on the Israelites who will carry this story home with them. We saw Egypt annihilated. So now you're playing mind games. This is a war over story now, not a war over power, right? So what happens? They'll fill your palaces up. Look at verse 7 on page 375. This is an interesting confrontation. Pharaoh's courtiers, that's his advisors, his National Security Council, said to him, "How long shall this one be a snare, a trap to us? Let the men go worship the Lord their God. Are you not aware that Egypt is lost?" What do you mean that's a strange statement? That's a marvelous statement. Ki avda Mitzrayim, meaning what? First of all, you've lost this battle already. You've lost this battle. He's more powerful than you. And are you willing to sacrifice the whole country to prove that you're stronger than him? Right? Some of you are old enough to remember various times in American history when causes were lost, but they were fought on for things like honor. Peace with honor, right? So, Nixon gets elected in 1968. I haven't seen the movie yet, so don't tell me what happens, right? Peace with honor. But by 67, everybody, even Johnson, knew the war was lost. But Nixon isn't going to lose the war. He's not going to lose the war. According to Johnson's biographer, it was the specter of Munich. He didn't want to be the one who lost Southeast Asia the way Chamberlain lost Europe. And you fight on because you want something called peace with honor. And how many kids died? How many lives were destroyed? I mean, thousands and thousands of people were destroyed. And the Pharaoh's advisors say to him, "Are you willing to sacrifice the whole damn country so that you can beat this guy?" And now it's in some ways, it's mano a mano with Moses and Pharaoh. It's the two of them opposite each other, right? So Moses and Aaron were brought back to Pharaoh. And he said to them, "Go worship your God." Who's going to go? And he said, "Well, we'll take everybody." And he said, "No, just take the men." And that didn't work. Turn the page. And God says, "Hold out your arm," and the locust came. Jump down to 376. We're doing this quickly because I want to get to the next part. Pharaoh hurriedly summoned Moses and Aaron. And now he confesses. He breaks him. He's broken. "I stand guilty before the Lord." It's not the first time he said this. It's the second time he said that. "Forgive my offense this once. Plead with the Lord. Remove this death from me." It's interesting. It's not from Egypt, but from me. From me. That's a powerful statement, right? Vayaser me alai rak hamavet hazeh. Remove it from me. This is personal now. It's no longer nation against nation. This is two guys opposite each other. The Lord caused a shift in the wind. Right? But the Lord stiffened Pharaoh's heart and he wouldn't let him go. Why? Because we're not done yet. We got to do two more. Ready? The Lord said to Moses, "Hold out your arm that the sky become darkness upon the land." And the darkness, and there's a wonderful set of midrashim, and some of them are listed here, and I urge you to read these. The midrash says, this is not like darkness, like you turn off the lights. This is the darkness of hell. This is a darkness, and what darkness can be a metaphor for, right? That people couldn't see each other. That there's a sense in which nothing, There's no sensibility about where I am in the world. The little boy was going to give his talk this morning, and I spent time learning this together. And the kid had this beautiful idea. He said, that's sort of what the Egyptians did, Like they couldn't see the Israelites as people. They made them slaves. I said, good, write that down. Right? This is and what is, and the Ramses is Ra-Meses, right? Son of the sun god, child of the sun god. So what do? You blot out the sun. This is not just a destruction of Egypt's physical infrastructure. This is a destruction of Egypt's mythical infrastructure. Its sense of itself, land of sunshine. It becomes the land of utter, pure darkness. And every metaphor you can imagine with darkness is attached to this in the Midrash. Yes, please.
When Pharaoh talks about Lord,
Yeah.
what is
He's talking to Moses as God.
about Moses?
Moses is God, yeah, Adonai, yeah. He's talking to you. Tell your God to stop all this. Because he realizes that Moses is not the guy doing it, that Moses is the prophet of the guy doing it, right? Right? And then Pharaoh said, okay, take all the people, but leave the flocks. So they say, no, we want everybody. And that's why that's when Pharaoh realizes this is a deception. And he's taking everybody, right? And now it ends with this. It's a very interesting sort of, now the editing of the story gets a little rough. Because what happens is, look at verse 27 on the bottom of 377. But the Lord stiffened Pharaoh's heart. He would not agree to let him go. And Pharaoh said, begone from me, take care not to see me again, for the moment you look upon my face, you will die. And Moses said, you got that right. Which is true, by the way, right? I'll not see your face again. And the Lord said to Moses, now where are they? So the image is that Moses turns around to leave, and God says, no, I got one more thing I want you to tell him. Tell him this, right? I will bring one more plague. And after this, he's going to let you go. So tell the neighbors to borrow all the dishes from the people next door, right? That's why you're never going to borrow my lawnmower. I know you Jews, right? And then Moses said, thus says the Lord, toward midnight, I'll go forth among the Egyptians. Every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstone, the firstborn of the cattle. There'll be a loud cry such as there never be, but not a dog shall snarl at any Israelite. Right? Then your courtiers will come to me and beg me to leave. And the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not heed and do these things. So now we're set up for the last plague. And just as you turn the page and you say, okay, let it come. Bring it on. We've been waiting for this, right? For 11 chapters. Guess what happens? Turn the page. Torah says, hang on a minute. Hang on a minute. I got some instructions for you. Now, look at who the audience is. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall mark for you the beginning of months. What? Where's the story? We stop the story. The narrative comes to a grinding halt, screeching halt. Now I'm going to give you instructions about how you're going to remember this event. Because the audience for the narrative isn't just Moses and Aaron at the time that it's happening. The audience of the narrative, cute hat. The audience of the narrative are all the future generations. So the first thing you're going to do is, this event is going to be January. This is going to be your New Year's. This is how you're going to count the calendar. Your calendar is going to be counted from the Exodus of Egypt. Okay, that's what I want you to know. Number 2, speak to the whole Israelite community. Say to them, on the 10th of the month, each of them shall take a lamb to a family, a lamb to a household. But if the household is too small for a lamb, let him share one with a neighbor who dwells nearby. In proportion to the number of persons, contribute to the lamb. All right, so we're going to get a bunch of families together, and we're going to buy a sheep. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a yearling male. Take it from the sheep or the goats. You keep watch over it till the 14th day. And on the assembled congregation shall slaughter it at twilight. You all do this, right, Erev Pesach? Right, of course you do. They take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and the lintel of the house in which they're to eat it. And they shall eat the flesh that night and eat it roasted over fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Who's he talking to? Is this for the generation in Egypt? Well, yes, both. It's for it's for us. It's for every subsequent generation. So when you eat Pesach, When you eat your Pesach meal, Erev Pesach, what are you doing? Ellie, come in. There's a seat here. Come here. It's too hot here. Okay. I would fix it, but you know my problem with thermostat. So then stay there. So who's this is for the generation of Egypt, but it's for every subsequent generation. There's this weird sort of time sense here in which the narrative is directed in two directions at once. It's at the moment, and it's also telling you for future generations, that's why you make Pesach. This is why you make Pesach, because you are reiterating the experience of your ancestors on the night before we left Egypt. You're reiterating that last night in Egypt. That's what Pesach is, the last night before Egypt. Now let me ask you a silly question. You ready for a very silly question? Okay, you're going to slaughter the lamb, right? And what are you going to do with the blood? Smear it on your. Well, that, by the way, we don't do that, but that would be an interesting custom to do, right? I mean, the ASPCA would get a little difficult, but that's okay. How come? How come? Why do you need to put blood on the lintel? To differentiate, so that what? So that what? So the firstborn, because the angel of destruction is going to come across, and the angel will see the blood on your lintel, and the angel would pass over your house. Piseach means to jump over your house. That's where the word Pesach comes from. It means to hop. The angel. Now let me ask you a silly question. If Santa Claus can tell who's been naughty and who's been nice, if Santa Claus knows if you've been sleeping, knows if you're awake, knows if you've been good or bad,
So be good for good. Oh, sorry.
how come the angel of death can't tell the same thing? Don't they work for the same guys? I mean, if Santa Claus can distinguish, I don't know about you, but for some strange reason, I stay up on the night of the 24th of December waiting for him to come down my chimney. And he don't come down my chimney. Now, you could say, idiot, because you have a mezuzah on the front door, you know, and he knows, right? But if Santa Claus can tell the difference between who's been naughty or nice, why can't the angel of death do the same? Yes, sir.
Once you start death, you can't stop it.
Okay, that's a very...
Goodness is okay, but once you start killing and death, it's difficult to stop.
All right, that's a very interesting observation, right? So the Midrash teaches, I'll repeat it, the Midrash teaches that the mashchit, the destroyer, is blind. And once you unleash destruction, it is indiscriminate. Once you unleash violence, it is indiscriminate. Once you unleash annihilation, it is indiscriminate. And so you have to do something to discriminate, because the destroyer on his own can't do it. Goodness can discriminate, but evil can't. Destruction can't. That's a very interesting observation about the world. Right? It's the rule of unintended consequences.
Ask the people of Syria.
Ask the people of any place where somebody said, oh, we'll have a surgical strike and send in troops. Right? Because you do not know where it's going to end. You cannot foresee how this is going to go down. It begins a process of destruction that's very hard to stop once you start it. Right? That's one observation. Very good. Sorry?
Isn't the putting the blood on the door kind of like a magic, manipulating the spirit of the angel?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Kind of blood magic. Now, by the way, what if it were cow blood instead of sheep blood? Would it work? No. You know, what if you painted it blue or green instead of red? Would it work? Is it magic? Is it specific? I mean, what are the rules? How much blood do you have to put? Right? What is the purpose of that ritual? One of is my dad's idea that the mashchit, the destroyer, is indiscriminate. And you've got to know that's what's going on. Rabbi Gelman.
Who am I, really? To add to your brilliant analysis. There's
No.
really nothing.
No, but I'm
to
sure
add.
there's
However, in your setup about the stories,
yeah.
there is just one small problem.
Yeah.
It's the same story.
What's the same story?
Story of the Pharaoh and the story of Moses. There and God, it's the same story. It's a different Pharaoh, but it's the same story. And what's the story? The story is that force can bring you freedom, that violence can bring you freedom. And that's the opposite of the truth. The story is that some superior source of power can bring you freedom. That is not true. Whether the superior force is Pharaoh or God, it's the same story. The tragedy of the Torah, the tragedy of the whole thing, is that there is another story, and it comes at Sinai, and it's about how the truth makes you free, not violence and force. And one of the problems of why violence and force cannot work to make you free is that it makes everyone a victim. Everyone in some way or another, the Egyptians, the slaves, the Hebrews, everyone's a victim, which means forces are acting on them that they have no control over. God understands that the story of Sinai is totally different. God was forced into this by Moses, who said, look, in this world, you're going to need violence, you're going to need it to get the people out, so face it. And God accepts it, and it destroys the Torah. The lintel, the blood on the lintel, is the first sign that the people are not victims, that they can do something on their own, not something done to them, but something done by them for their liberation. The blood on the doorpost is the first human act of liberation. Amen. Hallelujah.
Glory.
Praise Jesus.
No.
Oh, sorry.
Listen, you're betraying your Reform background here, so this, I mean, come on, man.
It's very hard. It's very hard.
I mean, that was a joke. I didn't mean that.
So does that
Wait.
work for you?
I want to go farther. I want to go deeper. I don't disagree with you, because I think that what you do have in the Torah, as you pointed out effectively, is a confrontation of two visions of how history changes. The Torah, this story is the apocalyptic revolutionary idea. Power to the people, bring down the powerful. The Sinai story is the truth which slowly changes you from the inside.
Words make you free. Ideas make
And
you
that's a confrontation of
free.
two.
Virtue makes you free.
But do you understand that's a confrontation of two different visions of history? But I think you're underestimating the importance of this story, and I think you had it at the very end. I want to just amplify what you said. I'm a slave. My parents were slaves. My grandparents were slaves. Their parents were slaves. My children are slaves. What does it take to slaughter a lamb and put its blood on my lintel? What's that going to take? Think about a slave now. What does a slave do? Whatever you tell him to do. Why does a slave do whatever you tell him to do? Partly because he's afraid of the master who will beat him. But by the third and fourth generation of slaves, the master doesn't have to beat him anymore. He accepts it. He buys that as his own identity. I am a slave, and this is what I am bound to do. This is my duty. This is my story. This is my definition, my self-definition. Comes along Moses and says, and Mark is right, Rabbi Gelman is absolutely right, this is the first act the Israelites have to do. It's the only thing they have to do in order to join the process of liberation. They have not been asked to do anything up to now. Everything has been, they've been an audience. In fact, the story begins by saying, they're an audience. I'm going to do this so they'll see what I did to Pharaoh. They're an audience. But now, Moses says, no more audience. You got to participate in your own liberation. You're an agent of your own liberation. But now I ask the question again. Third, fourth generation slaves. What mentality, what mental change, what mental break does it take for them to say, I'm going to put a sign, and by the way, it's not a sign on the inside of the door.
Right.
It's a sign on the outside of the door.
But they were ordered to do it
By Moses.
by Moses.
Yes. And what does it mean when Pharaoh's soldiers are walking through my neighborhood? What does it mean? But even, I'm saying, it's not even Pharaoh's soldiers. 4 generations, you're a slave. You don't need soldiers. The soldiers are inside of you. Right? You don't have the capacity to be independent. You've lost that capacity. That's the greatness of, that's slaves are like that. They've bought into the identity of being a slave. So Moses says to them, what?
Ain't gonna work on Maggie's farm no more.
Yeah, I want you to rise up now, and I want you to say, resistance.
Right.
Now, for a slave, part of it is I'm afraid Pharaoh's soldiers are going to come and kill me. But it's much deeper than that. It's my own internal sense of, oh my God, oh my God. That breaks my own identity. That breaks my story. It breaks my self-definition. What is it? Let's take, excuse me just a second, okay? I'm on a roll here, so I don't want to lose this. What does it take for an abused wife to stand up to the husband who's been beating the crap out of her and say, no more? Right? What did it take? You all heard this story about these kids. Right, these kids chained to their beds, malnourished and beaten, and this kid gets out and calls 911.
But she planned it for 2 years.
But what does it take? You have to break out.
You can't take it anymore. You physically, mentally, from body to your soul, you just can't take it anymore, and there has to be a change.
Yes, but but even that, I'm going to go. You're exactly right. You're exactly right. But even that, the voice that answers you is, well, he's not that bad. It could be worse. Yeah. You counsel an abused wife, and she'll tell you, oh, he's promised to get better. And what happens to my kids? What if it's worse for my kids? We know the end of the story. We know that they're going to get out. At the end of the Parsha, they will get out. They don't know that. They don't know that. They don't know that they're going to get out. As far as they're concerned, Pharaoh's all powerful. That's what they've bought. They're just, Pharaoh's going to torture and kill the rest of our children. It takes an act of mental liberation. Part of what the Torah is, and this is where I don't disagree with Rabbi Gelman's construction, because I think he's right. You have 2 stories here. The story of apocalyptic revolution and the story of internal revolution. But what's missing is the apocalyptic revolution depends upon an act of self-liberation. That's remarkable. That's miraculous.
That's the different story.
But that's what's here. That's why the Torah keeps telling you, look at the next one. I want you to remember this story. And when your kid says, why do you do all this weird stuff in your house? I want you to know this, because it is so easy for people to buy their own subjugation. I'm telling you, it is easy for people to be complicit in their own subjugation. And the faith in this God is a faith in a God who believes in your liberation, who is committed to your liberation. And a faith in a God who stands with the slave, not with the king, who stands with the downtrodden, not with the powerful. That's a revolutionary idea. The idea that history is so set up that it may take generations and generations, but eventually, as a great prophet once said, the arc of justice bends. The arc of history bends toward justice. That's a remarkable idea. It's a revolutionary idea. Yes?
So actually, based on what you just said, I want to change what I was going to say. I believe that God stands with both, with the slave and the king, and
Yeah.
that we have free will. We all have divine sparks.
Yes, yeah, no, you do.
So yes, but Moses could have given that the direction to do this, and he could have done nothing. We saw this in most recently. I saw the movie Dunkirk and Darkest Hour, and Churchill. Churchill is exactly the setup that you were discussing. Churchill was told Europe is lost, and he activated the civilian boats, and people went, and they didn't have to.
Yeah.
And so something happened, and Hitler decided not to bomb that beach, and he could have. He
Yeah.
had the power, and he didn't.
Yeah.
So I think that we all have the divine spark, but we have to act on it. We are responsible. We have free will.
Yeah.
And it's a human condition. We are both violent and we are cerebral.
But can you look at your own circumstance and say, the story that I'm telling about myself is wrong? There's a different story about me. I am not a slave. I am a human being temporarily incarcerated, right? It's a very different perspective. That's what you change the story. Please.
That's what the demonstration of the violent acts bring about and enable.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't have had the Sinai story without the previous story.
Well, see, that we can argue with Rabbi Gelman about whether,
That's my argument.
Right, the argument. See, the other thing is, the violent acts, of course, this is the story that the slaves, the ex-slaves told generation after generation. And part of it is the fantasy of the victim, to imagine, the destruction, his vengeance, the destruction of the victimizer, right? The fantasy of the victim. I mean, what's sweeter for these poor slaves but to tell the story of 10 plagues? I mean, my God, and it keeps getting worse and worse. Frogs are a bother, but lice are even worse. I mean, they're yucky and they get into crevices, and then diseases are even worse because that's internal. Each plague is worse and worse and worse and worse until you get to the last one, which is just sheer, utter death, indiscriminate death. I mean, it's just and then we'll get to next week, we get to, I have a preview for you, cross the Red Sea, which is, the chaos of the world comes crashing down on Pharaoh. It's the great fantasy, right? And what happens here is so interesting because I'm getting ahead of ourselves, but when we decide to tell that story, when you tell it in your Pesach Seder, what do you do? Dam, Tzvardeya, Kinim, Dever, Arav. What do you do? What do you do? Why? Why do you take out the wine?
You still mourn for what people had to go through because they're still human.
Because there is a tribal fantasy of let's destroy the bastards, at least in our imaginations. And yet, there's a higher moral sense. And the higher moral sense tries to suppress that tribal fantasy and say, but they're still human beings. Yes, you hate them, I get that, but you can't celebrate the destruction of humanity. That's not you. If there's anything you learned in Egypt, it's that. It's to see the humanity of the other. If there's anything you learned, that's what you learned. Right? Okay, I got a bunch of comments here. Mort's first. About 20 minutes ago.
I wanted to comment that God said that the Israelites cried out to him. That's what the burning bush story.
Right.
So they weren't content with being slaves.
I don't know. They weren't content with being slaves.
Why'd they cry out?
Well, the first, when did they cry out? According to the Torah, they don't cry out till 3 generations in. That's part of the interesting part of the story. When Pharaoh first makes them slaves, they don't cry out. When Pharaoh first starts throwing their kids into the Nile, they don't cry out. They actually don't cry out until he dies, until the Pharaoh who enslaved them died and the son takes over. Then they cry out. So there's a whole set of midrashim. It's a very good observation about why they didn't cry out for so long. And the most startling of those midrashim is what we just talked about. It says the deepest slavery is when you don't even know you're a slave. When you don't even know you're a slave, you accept it as normal. You accept it as normal. You don't cry out. It's only when someone stands before you and looks enough like you that you can identify with him or her, but you see that they're liberated in a way that you're not, that you suddenly say, hey, wait a minute, enough. You have to someone has to stand in front of you and say, there's an alternative. Enough. And that's what's, according to the Midrash, it's only when Moses shows up. It's like Moses brings the cry. But that puts Moses in an extraordinary position. He shows up and he says, I've come to liberate you. And the Israelites say, from what? And he says, you're slaves. And they say, so? That's what we are. You get the picture? That's what we are. Right? Betty Friedan showed up and said to the women of America, I've come to liberate you. And Phyllis Schlafly said, from what? I like being where I am. Right? From what? Martin Luther King came and said, I've come to liberate you, to the African American, to the black community. And when he got thrown in jail, the ministers of Birmingham, the black ministers of Birmingham, wrote him a letter saying, stop rocking the boat, you'll only make it worse. And then he wrote his famous document, The Letters from a Birmingham Jail, where he says, enough is enough. And that's the beginning of the civil rights movement. That's the process. Ronnie.
I don't understand what God's plan was, why he had to put us through slavery, liberation. What was the whole story about?
That's a very good question. So was the whole thing part of a plan? Is that the idea? Was the whole thing part of a plan, including all the suffering? The Bible seems to say it was. And the answer, and Mark's shaking his head because he's having a hard time.
God got dragged into it.
No.
Moses dragged him into it with the Yad Chazakah.
If you take, it could be, but if you take a look at the whole narrative, including the Abraham, he tells Abraham, your children are going to be enslaved for a long time. I think, if you look at, from my point of view, I think that part of it was to form a people that had a particular sensibility. Because you were a slave, you're going to look at the world very differently. You're going to see people very differently. For one thing, you're going to learn to see people. You're not going to see slaves, or the poor, or the immigrant, or the Muslim, or the gay man. You're going to see people, human beings, because you know what it was like to be relegated into a thing. You'll never allow that. I think that's the moral teleology of this. You'll never allow anyone to be put into that position again. Now, you'll respond to me, that's a pretty hard way to learn a lesson. And you're exactly right. So maybe this is a retrospective, post facto, you look back. Many of us have had experiences that were very difficult, tough experiences. If while you're going through a tough experience, a loss of a loved one, a disease, a crisis in your family, a crisis in your job, a crisis in your life, if somebody during the course of that comes to you and says, oh, this is going to make you a better person, you slug that person, right? That's what the book of Job is all about. But sometimes we can do that to ourselves. We can look back at that event afterwards and say, I learned something from that. It changed me, and it changed me for the better. I didn't want it. I don't want it for anybody else. But in fact, it changed me for the better. And I think that's how the thing got written.
Solzhenitsyn thanked God for prison.
Yeah.
He thanked God for his prison. Helen Keller thanked God for her blindness.
You look back at it. But you can't tell a person at the moment.
No.
Right? Because if you tell a person at the moment, it's cruel. It's just absolute. Someone told me when I was sick, it said, it's going to make you a much better rabbi. I said, you know what, I'll go back to being a lawyer. Take it away. You just, hang on, just Brian and then.
Do you think Martin Luther King would have approved of the 10 plagues?
No.
No.
Because he believed in nonviolence resistance.
So what should we look back?
Here's an interesting point of view. We have to.
Do we teach a higher
Hang on. So
God demonstrated?
there is a debate between Martin Buber and Gandhi. You can buy it. It's a book of letters between Martin Buber and Gandhi. Gandhi wrote, Buber was a real affidiccio of Indian philosophy. And he knew Gandhi. And Gandhi knew Buber. And Gandhi writes to Buber, you Jews should have used nonviolent resistance against the Nazis. And Buber writes back, they would have slaughtered us like sheep. Right? It worked with the British because the British had some conscience. But when you're dealing with an enemy who has no conscience, then nonviolence is an invitation to suicide. And Gandhi writes back to him, and it's a wonderful debate. And that's, if you put Martin Luther King into this, you'd end up with the same interesting conversation. King's nonviolence works because in America that has a conscience, and he believes in soul power. I don't believe George Wallace ever got the message of integration because of soul power. I think he got it because of the Marine Corps. I think so. But because Martin Luther, I think it's because of the conscience of America that civil rights happened, and Lyndon Johnson. He would have objected to this, and I think that I think Moses' response back to him would have been, it's an interesting conversation, would have been exactly as Buber's response was back to Gandhi. If you lie down in the streets in front of a god king, he'll just kill you. He has no conscience because his definition of you and his definition of himself doesn't lend for any room for change. Nonviolence only works where the other has something inside of them that allows them to see you as a human being, which the British did, right? And America did.
But King is still right, because he's saying the point is not to keep yourself from being killed. The point is to keep yourself from being changed.
Yeah. Except that.
History has made King out to be, he was not like, King also in his writings and in his speeches has said that there is a point at which, like,
Yeah.
We have painted him to be this, like, never ever gave in to anger, never ever acknowledged that there was merit in more violent resistance, and that's not true.
Yeah.
If you read what he has said,
Yeah.
what he has spoken, and what he has written,
Yeah.
there are times where he acknowledges that that is what you need.
Yeah, and he also recognized that he was playing a great game of good cop, bad cop with Malcolm X. No, it's true. He knew that. He knew that very well. And he comments about Malcolm. And he comments about Stokely Carmichael. And you can see that he gets it perfectly. Like, folks, you either deal with me or you deal with him. And if you don't want to deal with a guy, who's willing to burn your cities down, you better deal with me. And that's a very interesting use of violence. It's not an endorsement of violence, but it's a very interesting political use. You're exactly right. I got one more comment over here, right, Brian?
So when we sit around the Pesach table,
Yeah.
we're internalizing the story.
It's here. Here's Pesach, by the way. It's right here. Right, so just to give you, so I can read the line, then I'll. This day shall be to you one of remembrance. You will celebrate it as a festival to the Lord throughout your ages. You will overpay for brisket. You will celebrate 7 days. You will eat unleavened bread. On the first day, you remove the leaven. Whoever eats leaven, cut out of the community. You'll celebrate, and then 7 days you'll have constipation like you never can believe. Sacred, every person is to eat, and it's a conservative.
Oh, the
Yeah, we changed it a little bit. Tradition. Yeah, that's right. Right, and then you have the kids in this Torah portion. You have 3 of the 4 children, right? The kid is going to ask the question, why are we doing this, right? And you're going to have an answer for your child, right? I can have it. The kid's going to say, why are we doing this? And then you have an answer because this is my story. Brian.
So along those lines,
Yeah.
Is this a story of vengeance or is this a story of justice?
That's a great question. It's both. It is a story of justice. It is a story of liberation. It is the story that liberates you. But we are human beings, and human beings have flaws. And one of our flaws is, my God, we'd like to win. Right? When you're suffering, you fantasize about crushing the head of your victimizer into the dust.
Well, what's your assessment of the 10 plagues? Is that vengeance? Is it justice?
It's both. I think that it is the tool by which God breaks Pharaoh and breaks his story. Because the plagues not only destroy Egypt, they destroy every story of power in Egypt. The sun, the Nile, fertility, all of the images of Pharaoh's power, all the images of Egypt's mythology are destroyed by the 10 plagues. A very carefully constructed narrative, actually. But at the same time, it's the generations of victims tell a story, and they get a little bit of satisfaction. Look, what did the Midrash do to it? You all know the Midrash in the Haggadah? Rabbi Akiva says it wasn't 10 plagues, it was 250 plagues, Right? I had an Egyptian friend at my Seder one year, and he said, give me a break. I said, I'm sorry, But, you get this, that's the victim's mentality. I get that. You can't let that rule you, though. That's the point. You can't become a victimizer. That's the over and over again the Torah says. But because you were a slave in the land of Egypt, don't become them. Don't become them. Okay? Don't fail to see the humanity of the other. That's what we talked about last night. Okay? So this Torah portion is about the end of we get out of Egypt at the end. But it really is, most of all, is we get out of the story. Our story changes and Egypt's stories change. Egypt suddenly has to realize where it is in the world. Pharaoh has to realize who he really is. And our story changes. And to hold that story of liberation and not let you buy into your own subjugation, That's why the story becomes the eternal story. Next week, we cross the Red Sea. Please come back. Have a good Shabbos.
God is human beings' God. Everyone's God, right? It's not just for Jewish people.